Welcome to today's episode of Foresight by Groundline USA. I'm Tripp Winkler, and joining me today is President of Groundline USA, Christian Nolden. Christian, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me, Tripp. I appreciate you letting me join you.
Absolutely. Well, there's certainly a lot to be excited about coming out of Groundline USA, so let's dive in a little bit to that. I recently read the Groundline USA paper on grid resilience versus reliability. And we often hear about reliability, modernization, cybersecurity, and so on. So, talk to me a little bit about this paper, but also what is the industry not talking about that it probably should be?
Sure, those are great questions. The paper was really created because these are two terms, resiliency and reliability, that are very similar, but they overlap so much that I think the definitions are getting confused. And so we want to just put something out there to say, hey, they aren't the same thing, and here are some of the basics that make the difference. Resiliency is really important from our perspective because, quite simply, we think resiliency is focused on the unusual, the rare occurrence that doesn't happen that often, and sometimes when people are making decisions, gets put to the side. So if you're sitting there making risk management decisions where you look at your 5x5 risk matrix and you say, well, consequence times likelihood is this, so it's probably not going to happen. Well, we all know in the real world out there where the assets are, stuff happens that you didn't think was going to happen. And so you have to consider that, because if you have everything addressing that, that risk matrix, you're going to have a whole bunch of occurrences that probably are outside of what your thinking is. And so resiliency is about, how do I deal with those things that are outside of that framework you're using without necessarily having to do something that's extremely cost ineffective or that you otherwise wouldn't do. So really it was about, don't forget about those things. How do we build a grid that can handle those types of occurrences? And as we know, a lot of that has to do with extreme weather that we're seeing more and more. You mentioned resiliency, of course, cybersecurity, digitization. There's a bunch of buzzwords that we're talking about, and they're all great things. But I think we're missing the connective tissue between all those. And to me, that's asset management. And asset management is about syncing up all the various parts of a company's business so that they're thinking about how to get the best out of these long run assets that we have, especially in the utilities, where assets can be out there for 40, 50, 60, 70 years. And when you think about digitization or cybersecurity, you should be thinking about, okay, why am I implementing cybersecurity? Why am I implementing a digitization strategy? Why am I looking at resiliency and thinking about a resiliency strategy? And those have to be tied to, how am I getting the best outcome with my assets for the lowest long run cost? And I feel that a lot of times when you're looking at any of these things, these buzzwords, cybersecurity, digitization, it's just looking at products and solutions just for that purpose. And you're missing, I think, the reason why you're trying to implement those. Because sometimes the best digitization strategy might be to skip a certain area for a bit of time until certain things happen. And I'll get to that in a second. And same with cybersecurity. I think what you have to do is look at, okay, what's the asset management strategy behind all of this? And a lot of that is based on, what's my data strategy? And the data strategy, sure, it does tie into digitization and cybersecurity and all that, but at its core, it's, you have some assets out in the field and you need to be thinking about, what's the data I need to make the best decisions about those assets? And so that could be very simple data that doesn't need a digitization strategy or a cybersecurity strategy. Maybe it's just, is the asset still standing? Yes or no? Sure, you can turn that into a digital data point or something like that later on. But really, it's, what are the asset data points I need to make those assets live and exist longer and for a cost-effective outcome? And so really thinking about, what am I trying to do with my assets? How do I manage those assets? And what data do I need to manage those assets better? That's what we should be talking about. And that's really important, because it ties back into probably the other thing we're not thinking about with these strategies is, what's happening at the engineers level, what's happening at the lineman level, what's happening at the inspector level. How do they go about and collect the data? How do they manage these assets? If you think about those details, more and more, I think you find out that maybe if you take slow steps to meet your digitization strategy, it's possibly something that, may not look like a grandiose plan. Maybe you stay at a very, I'll call it immature level, where you're using spreadsheets and you're using paper checklists and that for quite a long time. But if you've improved the data strategy and if you've improved the asset management strategy, that might be okay. So maybe it doesn't look like a digitization strategy for quite some time, because I don't think those digital solutions should be the end all be all. I think they should be an outcome of these core strategies that help you manage the assets better. So that, in my opinion, I think that's a missing piece to all this.
Absolutely. So it kind of all ties back into asset management, which seems like such a glaring thing. Well, yeah, but I mean, it definitely seems like it's easily overlooked, and that kind of leads to where I was going with this, and that's that you touched on it a little bit. Utilities are so focused on the capital expenditure side of things, reducing operational costs. But what about smart operational spending? What should utilities really think about that OpEx spending?
I think smart OpEx is an interesting term. It's important discussion. I think a lot of utilities would first think we are spending our OpEx in a smart way, and I don't necessarily think that they're not. So let's give them some credit, because they've been doing a really hard job for a long time. I think there's always an opportunity to revisit how OpEx is being spent, and I think what happens a lot of times is the utilities, and especially the investor-owned utilities, they're incentivized for spending capital dollars. They get a rate of return when they spend these capital dollars. And so what that tends to do is it makes them look at their operating costs and saying, how can I convert some or all of those into capital costs so that I can get a rate of return? And there's some benefit to that for sure. But I also think what that does is it creates a bias towards spending in the CapEx. And part of that is taking away from OpEx. I'd like to say first that they don't have to be in opposition of each other. They're sort of two parts of the same pie, and really they should be thought of together in a more holistic manner. So I think what they should be thinking about is, what do I absolutely need to see and learn and do with my assets, and convert that into a rough annualized cost on the operating side, and trying to figure out how to best use that money to continue that spend. And I think that's important, because that won't necessarily be a same dollar value as you go into the future. Most of the assets in the US grid are pretty old, and they're getting older every year. And so you can't assume you can do everything for the same dollar. And so you have to think about, what do I need to do with those assets over the time? And that comes back to having solid data about where the assets have come from, so you can understand their pathway forward to some extent. You don't have to do a full study of all of your assets. You see a lot of solution providers saying, you're going to get all this data about all your assets, and you're going to be able to do all these wonderful statistic studies and all that. I mean, I've been there as an asset manager myself, and that's a great goal, but I don't think it's feasible across the board. And so you really have to understand which assets are critical, why they're critical, what data do I need, how do I collect that data using operating dollars, and how do I turn that into an understanding of where my assets are heading. Once you do that, then you can start optimizing your operating expenditures. But I don't necessarily think you should be thinking about how to turn it into capital dollars. I think you should be thinking about, if I can save the money here by doing this task I need to do for my assets, fantastic. If it then leads into capital dollars, then that might be a benefit and an additional thing that's sort of icing on the cake. But it doesn't necessarily have to be, how do I take that and turn it into a capital dollar? Because I think that sort of thinking leads to pulling money away from operating expenditure buckets, when the assets are going to need that operating expenditure bucket more and more as it ages. So I think that's where I like to put my headspace on when I'm evaluating how to approach assets. I know there's different models of regulating around the world and around the country, and I think the regulatory regimes are also something that utilities should be thinking about with their regulators. There's an interesting approach that's taken in some other countries in the world called TOTEX, and that's total expenditure. And so what that does in the regulatory regimes where that's being used is it takes capital and operating dollars and puts it together, and it turns it into different buckets of money. So instead of OPEX and CAPEX, it thinks about, for example, fast money and slow money. And fast money is money where you don't necessarily get a rate of return on, but that could be capital and operating. So it takes the incentive to turn it into capital dollars away, and it just focuses on the things that, yes, those are expenses. And slow money could be operating expenditure or it could be capital expenditure, and utilities can get a rate of return on that. So it incentivizes utilities to spend money on both of those if it makes sense to manage these assets as they age and as you're trying to deal with all of the new challenges of the world. So I think there are different ways of envisioning operating expenditure that I believe could help when utilities are trying to understand and learn more and more about these aging assets.
I'm sensing a theme here. It all ties back to asset management, and an important theme at that. So I just really have one parting question before we wrap things up. And that's, you've identified rather, these challenges facing the industry and some questions that leadership should be asking or talking about. But how do we go about getting to the answers? How do we solve some of these challenges?
That's a really great question. Implementation is always the most important, but the hardest part of this. And I feel that there's a couple of things that we should be thinking about. First one is tapping into the wide breadth of knowledge that utilities already have. And so I'd encourage utilities inside of themselves to bring in their subject matter experts into the strategic discussions. They may be doing that, and where they are, I believe you'd probably see much more maturity and much more advancement of asset management principles and better management of the utilities assets. And I think what that means is having the people at the shop floor, so to speak, provide insights into what they are seeing every day and what they are seeing work and not work, and doing that on a regular basis with new solutions as they're being piloted, with new approaches, with new requirements. That way it can be tested really quickly on the shop floor with the engineers, with the linemen, with the people that are down there managing and seeing these assets every day. And so it's about increasing the cadence of some of this information sharing within the utilities. But I think the second part of it is making sure that people from the utilities at multiple levels are taking part in industry forums that combine both industries of different types and sizes, but also vendors of different sorts. And I feel that right now there's a bit of a new drive to connect. After COVID, people have been isolated for so long. So I'm seeing much more participation in forums like conferences and working groups, which is great. But I also feel like there's still a little bit of that barrier between vendors and the utilities, where the vendors are trying to sell something and the utilities are trying to learn. And there's a space there where vendors can share information from what they're seeing because they get the benefit of dealing with multiple utilities, and utilities can share what they need and also what they're seeing, and they can provide the depth of experience that the vendors need to make their solutions better. So I feel that there's a need to have those forums, make sure that they're done in a spirit where you're not just trying to do a hard sale on someone if you're a vendor like me, and you're trying to communicate openly. And I feel as well, once you get into a stage where you've been asked to respond to a quote or come in and provide your solutions, have an open discussion around that with utilities where you're saying, look, this is what we do this fantastic service, or we have this great product, and it will help you. But I hear what you're saying, and you as a utility are providing me with greater context, and I would really strongly advise utilities do provide that broader context and not be so close shop about some of that information, because hopefully vendors will say, my solution, however great it is only part of the answer. I know someone who does this other part, or have you tried my competitor, heaven forbid. But there are times when I think vendors need to say, I can be part of the answer, but better yet, I really want you to know about this approach and maybe it doesn't include me this time, but if you take this approach, it'll help you. It'll help you learn more about managing your assets and using that operating money even better. So I feel that it's really about having these discussions and moving the information forward, because the industry has everything they need in their brains. It's just about putting it together to come up with these solutions, and not being too proud to say, I didn't do this right, or this is better if you go here instead of over to me. And I really feel that with all the tools that are out there now, if those kind of open discussions are having, the solutions will come to the fore pretty quickly, and will enable a lot of the goals we're trying to get by improving some of the approaches on the asset management side.
Absolutely. Well, what a great way to wrap up this episode. What's the old quote by Spock? The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few or the one. That definitely sounds like where the industry is headed, and where it should be, for the greater good. So, Christian, thank you so much again for sharing those valuable insights and taking some time out of your day to be here.
Thanks again, Tripp. I really appreciate it. It was a great opportunity to chat to you today.
Absolutely. Well, be sure to follow Groundline USA on LinkedIn to stay up to date on all of the latest news, developments, and podcast episodes. We'll see you next time.